My name is Ian Bettridge. I'm Director of Content for New Food Magazine. Welcome you all here. I am in no way a food expert, but I'm here to introduce somebody who is. So Darren Detweiler is a noted academic, food safety expert, consultant, wears many hats, and is all around one of the most brilliant people in the industry. So without further ado, Darren, over to you.
Is our food safety journey one without an actual destination? I have grappled with this question for over 30 years. But that's not the question I'm actually here to answer. Is our food actually safer today? I wish I could say yes. I wish I could say no. The reality is, I don't think if you look at food in terms of its raw nature, it's any safer or less safer than it was 10, 20, 40 years ago. When we look at food today, we have to take into consideration how much distance it's traveled, how much commercially packaged goods and ready-to-eat foods, how consumer behavior patterns and preferences have radically changed how we define food. We can talk about our grandparents, our great-grandparents, and how their relationship with food was one way, but I don't think that they would recognize our relationship with food as the same. Even in the last while since I've been here in Amsterdam, and this is my second trip to Amsterdam this year, I was faced with a change in my thinking of things. I have been talking about food in terms of how even since the pandemic, the way we get food has changed. We have third-party shopping, we have third-party delivery, we have everything from motorcycles and mopeds and bicycles delivery. There's parts of the world where they're exploring drones for delivering foods. We have people that do our shopping for us, and then other people deliver that food to our house. We have partially prepared foods, we have frozen goods. We have opportunity now where we're bypassing the middleman and we are buying foods directly from the manufacturer over the internet. But not everything's new. In Amsterdam, I just witnessed with my own eyes two things that I thought I hadn't seen since I was a child. Automats. You ever know what an automat is? You pay and you open the little door and you take out what item you want, kind of thing. That was around from the 1880s until about the 1980s. And the idea that it's coming back. Now, I could be like, okay, this is a great, fantastic way to talk about food, but think about it. All these different ways, whether they're new or there's a resurgence of the old, create situations in which there are blind spots. There are opportunities where we lose track of time and temperature. And we may have barriers, but even barriers start asking questions in terms of what is that transparency? How do we know that this was, the ingredients that are said on these items? I have to admit, I did not see actual labeling on these packages that it was just like a container with a sandwich or with French fries or whatever it was on there. I didn't see the labeling ingredients. If you're talking about allergens, which is one of the topics here, I would be of a concern to mine. I would say if I had an allergic concern, a food allergy concern, I would say I would not even trust that for a second, because of all the questions I would be asking and all the kind of concerns I would have in terms of the transparency. So food itself is not any safer or less safer. Pathogens are an inherent part of nature. They are there. It is our job to try to minimize, to remove, to prevent them from becoming worse, to prevent consumers from becoming harmed. Now, one thing we have seen is policies, procedures, differences in how we look at likelihood and severity, technologies, digital solutions, blockchain or other forms of digital thermal intelligence or other ways in which we are finding new platforms, digitized platforms in terms of transparency. We have to recognize that if food safety itself has not changed, at least the tools and the policies that we are using, the certifications, the global standards that we are using have made an impressive impact in terms of, is our food safer or not? There has been a great deal of progress, but we're not perfect. In terms of certain realities, we can recognize that most of those statistics about the number of people that are hospitalized, the number of people who are ill and don't necessarily even report it, and of course the number of people who die every year due to failures in food safety, those numbers have remained relatively consistent over the last 3 decades. Now one could say, and I've thought about this, one could say, well, if food safety wasn't as good as it was in terms of what we're doing, perhaps those numbers would be worse because of all these changes in our landscape of food safety. That's hard to calculate though. But we have to realize that there are certain realities we have to face. 30 years ago, when I became involved in food safety, most of our discussion was, especially within the media and with any sense of the consumer perspective, was around meat. We've seen that the discussions around food safety, there are still concerns around meat. Right now there's a significant outbreak tied to deli meats in the United States. But we've also seen with eggs and with produce and with romaine lettuce and with cucumbers and sprouts, so many different forms of food. Again, not only the meat or the produce, but the ready-to-eat, the commercially packaged goods, all of them provide opportunities to look at how foodborne pathogens do not discriminate. They don't care what kind of food you're talking about, what company, what region of the world it comes from, all those different factors. It's something we have to take into consideration. There was a great deal of this that we talked about in the documentary Poisoned. Anyone see the documentary Poisoned on Netflix? 30 years ago, I was actually working with television executives and with book publishing companies to write the story about this. And in the documentary Poisoned, I talk about how my son, 16 months of age, died from E. coli in 1993 during the Jack in the Box E. coli outbreak. And back then, the entire efforts to create a television movie and write a book about it was thwarted because executives felt that the American public had no stomach for conversations about these types of concerns. That the idea of talking about problems with our food was something that the average American audience does not want to see. To look at the idea that 30 years later, not only do we have an Emmy-nominated documentary that's been up in the ranks in terms of many countries around the world, but if you look at the sheer number of books and magazines, web pages, podcasts, blogs, conferences, events around food safety, that becomes an impressive way of looking at how things have changed in terms of the food safety culture over the last 3 decades. But that's aside from consumers. Have consumers themselves changed? And by the way, we're all consumers. It's not like you either work in the food safety or food industry or you're a consumer. We're all consumers. But I think we can all recognize, how many people have ever seen a meme or a viral video on social media talking about food safety? Things of that nature. I think social media has done an incredible job of changing how today consumers are far more considered as stakeholders in the bigger picture of our global food supply than ever before. Consumers ask questions. Consumers have preference. Consumers can build pressure. And in some cases, it's not pressure after the fact, it's more time, yes, in terms of after the fact, the idea that companies are trying to resolve issues faster, but the idea of consumers realizing the impact of consumers, because today, consumers are literally voting with their food money. If a company is experiencing a failure in food safety, there's an outbreak, there's a recall, that is seen as a situation where that trust between the consumer and the company, the overall reputation is not the same as it was before, and consumers can say, I can take my food money and go elsewhere. I'm literally voting with my dollar. I'll buy from this brand, I'll buy at this retail, I'll buy at that restaurant, I'll cook it myself at home, whatever it is. And I think that the industry is starting to see this more and more. Another way of looking at food safety is, there's a phrase, actually there's 2 phrases I want to point on. One is, in the documentary, I brought up the idea that I'm not fond of legislators or certain executives saying that America has the safest food and supply in the entire world. At the same time, a recent statement by a prominent American politician that big companies in America are poisoning millions of Americans. Big food companies are poisoning millions of Americans. Saying that they're poisoning millions of Americans, that is a statement embedded with intent. Are millions of consumers becoming poisoned, if you will, from foodborne pathogens every year? Yes. However, to say that companies are poisoning them is not exactly the way I would have described that. Over the last 31 years of my career, if I had faced only companies that had that kind of intent, I don't think I would be here today. But I have had the great opportunity to be impacted, influenced, and encouraged by so many leaders, so many companies that they prioritize, they invest, they train in food safety every single day. They make food safety such an important part of their product and of their brand name, and they go beyond that. They look at even their competitors. They look at the entire industry and how they can help the industry. Even people in this room, the idea of sharing what you have learned, sharing your ideas, trying to help others who you might not even know, but are coming to hear you speak today and tomorrow to look at these ideas of sustainability, allergens, the cost of food safety, so many topics we're going to be discussing today. But talking amongst ourselves is one thing. One of the things that I deal with is I talk with families far too frequently who have either recently buried a child due to a failure in food safety or whose child is in the hospital on dialysis, suffering from hemolytic uremic syndrome. And sometimes they'll even send me pictures over their phone. And they'll tell me what's going on, and they'll ask for some advice. And they'll say, Darren, it's 2024. How can this be happening? And what's scary is that in 1993, there's a television news camera interview of me where I was saying, this is 1993. How can this be happening? And those photos they send me look exactly the same. A very small child, dwarfed by wires and tubes and monitors. No matter how we characterize food safety as being better or worse today, any one failure has the same exact devastating impact on a family. So what do we need to do? We need to realize that nothing I'm talking about is new, whether I'm talking about 30 years or 120 years. In 1906, Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, woke up many of its readers' eyes to what was going on in the Chicago meat plant. It resulted in changes in US policy around pure food and drugs and about meat inspection. But the London Daily Times literary review of the book talked about the novel in its real-world context. And it discussed how the things described by Mr. Sinclair happened yesterday, are happening today, and will happen tomorrow and the next day until some Hercules comes to cleanse the filthy stable. Now, in our world of DC and Marvel superheroes, we know that there's not a Hercules. But perhaps that was a rather poetic way of saying that food safety requires a Herculean effort, an enormous amount of work, strength, and courage. All the technology that we see represented here and that we see in our field definitely helps us with our work and our strength. But none of that can really help us with our courage. We have to have the courage to not only use the right technology, but to ask the right questions, to analyze the data, to act upon that data. We have to have courage to have that vigilance and the persistence, whether we're talking about becoming overburdened by a wall of data or stymied by a lack thereof. Even this recent outbreak with deli meats in the United States, there's 69 different reports from federal inspectors showing these problems. And yet the question remains, why weren't these reported incidents, these reported failures, these reported conditions. Why were they not acted upon? I don't think it was the worker's strength behind it. I think it was the courage. We must make sure that we have the courage to not only talk to those around us, to talk to those who are making the decisions, whether it's a purchasing decision or the decision to take actions, and make sure that they understand the true burden of this. We have to make sure that we have the courage to talk to families who've been impacted by this. And I think that part of that courage is this idea of looking at, sure, perhaps this food safety journey doesn't have a destination, but every sailor at sea has to have a destination in order to leverage the sails, to harvest the power of the wind. We must think that our destination is perhaps there is a world where we can prevent as many families from living forever with a chair forever empty at their table. We can think that perhaps there's a day where there's less outbreaks, there's less recalls, or that these recalls are smaller in size, or they're not nearly crossing as many geographic lines, or that there can be more proactive activities, more predictive analytics that could catch things before they become almost insurmountable. We have to have that destination in mind. Whether or not we achieve that, that's for our future legacy to determine. But if we want to have a legacy in terms of food safety, if we want to say that we are working towards a future where our food is more safe than it was in the past, then we have to have that idea of a destination in terms of where our food is safer. And we have to cultivate and nurture and validate the courage that it takes to do this day in and day out. Is our food safer? I can't say yes or no, but I could say that our work today in food safety is more effective, is more efficient, and exemplifies much more courage at a grand scale today than ever before. And for that, I thank you. Tell me if I'm wrong. What time do we have left? We have 5 minutes left. I have time for a question, apparently. I will say this while you're thinking of a question. If you haven't already scanned your badge or got your badge, I was asked earlier to remind folks that there's a registration desk where you can get your badge and make sure they scan the badge so that they know who's here. I saw a hand over here. Sterling?
So, what would be the biggest change you'd be looking for the future?
Well, there's a lot, but I only have time to really share about one. Too many times, I would say that the prevalent question industry asks of subject matter experts, of food safety experts, is how much will it cost to do this? How much will it cost to do this? Raise your hand if you've heard that question. How much will it cost to do this, to buy this technology, to implement this procedure, to recall, right? That's not the question we should be answering. The question we should be answering is, what's the cost of doing nothing? How much will it cost if we don't do this? If we had a better sense of how much it would really cost in terms of economics, in terms of reputation, in terms of people's lives, in terms of reevaluating likelihood and severity, perhaps that would be a more impactful conversation, a more impactful response to those questions, and can result in people who have that purchasing or implementation power, but don't necessarily have that direct contact in terms of the ongoings of food safety, the workforce, or even the consumer side of things. Perhaps that will impress them to think differently in terms of their role in food safety. Have time for one more? All right, he says yes. One more question. Yes, ma'am.
You said this is a journey maybe without a destination. What do you think are the limits? Is there going to be something, with the things you see on the horizon that might really change?
So I don't think we need to go to Soylent Green where we're all just eating capsules or tablets or wafers or something like that. Because of course there'll be new blind spots, there'll be new concerns. But I do think, just as how we're seeing the kind of return back to the automats, perhaps there will be a pendulum swing where people are realizing they want to be closer to the source. They want to perhaps buy more raw ingredients. We saw a shift a number of years ago in the United States. The US Bureau of Labor and Statistics, their data showed that for the first time in recorded history that Americans were spending more of their food money on food that was prepared outside of the home than they were on food that was prepared inside the home. I imagine that there's going to be a cultural shift in the next 10, 15 years where we'll see that pendulum swing back and people will want to be dealing with less commercially packaged and ready-to-eat foods and perhaps more raw ingredients. I think that the whole culture around everything from Ozempic to weight loss, things of that nature, is also going to help fuel that desire to get back to the basics in terms of more raw foods, more raw agriculture ingredients. And I think one of the things that's also going to help drive that is people are starting to realize that there are great marketing tools out there that are very confusing. Just because it's premium and you pay more for it does not mean it's safer. Just because it's organic doesn't mean it's safer. And yet that's how some of these things are being marketed. That's how some of these things are being talked about in retail. So we have to be careful of these terms because the average consumer is starting to have a fatigue around all these words that are being used to be euphemisms or to hide something, to be deceptive in terms of, don't look over here, look here. It's premium, it's this. So that's part of where I see will be that drive to, I'm not saying it's going to be 100%, but I do believe we're going to start to see a shift more towards people wanting to be closer to the source, people want to have more control over the ingredients and not allow it to be completely frozen or packaged or manufactured outside of the home. So perhaps a shift back from the Jetsons to the Flintstones, or somewhere in the needle point in between. Thank you very much, and I look forward to our conversations in the next few days.